Alrighty, so I know that this one is going to be pretty controversial. This one is, I think, a lot more subjective than some of the others that I have done in terms of the best campaigns for different types of gameplay. And so let's go ahead and dive into this one. So first of all, I want to start out by saying one of the things that makes Warhammer Total War so unique compared to the other Total Wars is the introduction of the single entity units, whether we're talking about the beasts or we're talking about the characters. And so what I wanted to focus on in this one is one aspect of those, which are specifically the heroes. And every faction has got some really good heroes. So that's what I mean by this is going to end up being a pretty subjective comparison between some of the different factions and my choice for which campaign I believe provides, excuse me, provides the best experience when it comes to having really effective use of heroes. So hopefully this will make sense, but I know, like I said, it's going to be controversial. Please feel free to share your own comments. I'm pretty familiar with most of the different factions, but obviously I've played some more than others, and it's certainly possible that I may have missed something, and I know that a lot of you are going to be you're going to have some very strong opinions about which factions have the best heroes, and I'd like to hear some of those. So anyway, moving on. So when it comes to which faction has good heroes, which races have good heroes, let's start with that. You've got a lot of good choices to choose from. One of my favorites, of course, is the Greenskins, and specifically Skarsnik. So let's talk about Skarsnik, for example. He has the advantage of doubling the experience for all of his hero units. So boom, right off the bat, you've got some really quickly leveling up hero units, and that is certainly a big plus. However, I'm not going to ultimately go with the Greenskins because there are some limitations when it comes to the Greenskins, in particular with the Goblin big bosses, for example. They are really only particularly useful as field agents. They're really not terribly good in combat. You can kind of make the same argument really for the Goblin Shaman, who their spells are just not as powerful as most of your wizard units and other factions. Anyway, I still love Skarsnik. I still think he's a good choice for some really strong heroes, but he's not the best choice. You've got the vampire counts, of course, and in particular, some of their vampiric heroes, really very strong. The necromancers are good as well. I'm a big fan of the vampire counts, and I even made a video, if you may have seen that, about which faction has the easiest early game, and I felt like it was Isabella in particular, largely because of the strength of her heroes, in this case being her vampire units, and the fact that she can get so many of them right away. It really helps out with the early game. But moving on into the mid and late game, that advantage certainly falls off a lot. So still love the vampire counts. They have great heroes, but again, they're not going to be the best choice. So let's talk a little bit about what I think makes for a good heroes-focused campaign. And I think there's 3 parts to this. So the first part is you need to have a lot of heroes available to you. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I shouldn't really need to go into any elaboration on that. The second thing is I think those heroes should feel like they are a really integral part of your campaign. Whether you're using them on the battlefield or as field agents, you really I think a good heroes campaign is one that can at least focus, I don't want to say exclusively on heroes, but you can really rely on heroes to be sort of the backbone of your army, or at least very, very major contributors. And I think it needs to be not just in the early game, like was the case with Isabella, but also moving on into the mid and late games as well. One way that heroes can provide a lot of value in battle is not just by what they do themselves, but also some of the modifiers that they provide to some of your other units. And then moving on to the third thing, I think this is going to be incredibly subjective, of course, but that is that I like heroes that feel distinct and flavorful instead of just kind of feeling like same old, same old. And that's a little bit harder to describe, but just kind of heroes that are fun. So when we take these three factors into consideration, I do think that there is one race that sort of stands out in terms of meeting all three of those qualifications, in terms of being able to field lots and lots of your heroes, having heroes that really contribute a lot to your campaign, and have a lot of sort of distinctive variety between the types of heroes. And so, no big surprise, I'm going to lean towards Skaven, who I think are actually the most versatile overall, the most, the most creative and distinct race in the game in terms of having some real variety between the different legendary lords that you choose. And so no big surprise that in the very creative way that Skaven have been implemented in this game, they also provide a lot of variety and theme and value in their hero units. So let's talk a little bit about why the Skaven have lots and lots of availability of units. Well, we'll show some examples here when I jump into the campaign, but just right off the bat, first of all, you've got you've got access to having very high capacity for many chieftains. So all you got to do is build barracks units up to the second tier. So you could do that in practically every settlement if you wanted to, and every single one of them increases your capacity for chieftains, and chieftains are quite good warrior units in battle. So you could really focus very heavily on your chieftains, and some of your legendary lords provide benefits to your chieftains. And of course, you can boost them through the technology tree as well. So chieftains are certainly one hero right off the bat where you can recruit lots and lots of them, and they provide good value on the battlefield. They also can provide really good benefits to your legendary, well, not just your legendary lord, to all your lords of your armies, because they can add ward save to your lords. So it's really good to have some of them to help protect your lords in battle. Okay, then the other really, really important factor to consider here when it comes to Skaven and their prolific use of characters is with Plague Priests. You can basically get yourself tons and tons of Plague Priests really easily and, quite frankly, pretty quickly in the game. And I'll show you an example of that. But yeah, Plague Priests, just by the virtue of the Bell Polisher ancillary, which is pretty easy to get. All you got to do is be idle in a region that has or it might even be a province, that has an order building, and boom, get yourself Bell Polisher, just stack them up on your Plague Priests, and you can just keep recruiting more and more and more of them. And then finally, the third thing that I mentioned, sort of the thematic quality to the heroes. I think that's pretty obvious when it comes to the different types of heroes that the Skaven have. You've got your chieftains, who are your brutish melee fighters. You've got your Plague Priests, which of course, and I don't want to forget the Eshin sorcerers, but of course they're, I think, far inferior to your Plague Priests. But these are your basic wizards in battle, but they get access to really, really strong spells. In particular, the ability to summon clan rats, and if you want to spend a little bit more, you can summon plague monks. And then, of course, there's a lot of value in the Plague Vortex spell, which is a stationary, heavy damage spell, which is situational, but in the right situations, it is incredibly powerful. So your Plague Priests are very powerful when it comes to wizards. They certainly, I think, are superior to the aforementioned Goblin Shamans, for example, that you get in the Greenskins campaign. Then you got your pack masters, which modify your monsters. If you want to lean heavily into monsters units, they can provide value in that. And you've got your warlock engineers, which are really good at helping all of your ranged units. So you've got lots of variety here. You've got the units that are very strong themselves in battle. You've got units that provide a lot of useful buffs to some of your other units in battle. So Skaven heroes really kind of have it all. Oh, and of course I almost forgot the assassin unit, and assassins for the Skaven make really, really effective field agents. And so now we've kind of narrowed it down to just the Skaven. Well, which of the different legendary lords then can best leverage the value of these heroes? Well, I'm a little bit biased in this because I love him and I know that he's one of the least popular legendary lords out there, so I want to always stick up for him. But I think in this case, there's a little bit of objectivity to it as well, because if you're going to lean very heavily into the use of Plague Priests, and why wouldn't you? Because, like I said, you have loads and loads of them available to you, well, then what you want to do is you want to roll with Skrolk. Skrolk is all about buffing the Plague Priests if you put them in his own army, and then thematically, Plague Priests fit really well into his faction. Okay, so I can already hear the protests forming, and that's fine. Go ahead and let me know whether or not you think this was a good decision or not. But in any case, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward and show a little bit of this as some examples in the campaign. And in particular, Skrolk is kind of a uniquely difficult campaign, I believe. So I'm going to show a little bit of what I consider to be useful tips and tricks to be able to win with Skrolk, build yourself up to the point where you can really exploit these hero units. And as always, a couple of basic parameters for me. I always play on Legendary very hard. I don't use cheese, so nothing against anybody who does want to use cheese tactics, but I won't be showing any of those. I think Skrolk is a really fun campaign. I don't think it's necessary to do any exploiting of the AI, and I think you're actually kind of doing yourself a disservice if you do that, because, like I said, he's kind of a uniquely challenging campaign and thus very, very rewarding when you do well with him. So let's go ahead and talk about how to play Skrolk. The main thing to keep in mind in the early game with Skrolk, and the reason why this is such a challenging campaign, is because you are really surrounded by enemies who hate you, and all of them will go to war with you sooner rather than later. So you start out at war with this minor Lizardmen faction just to your south, but it won't be very long before you find yourself at war with some major Lizardmen factions as well. And so really the trick to playing Skrolk in the early game is to try to get to the point where you're fighting only one of them at a time. You get to the point where you're fighting more than one and they can very easily overwhelm you. Of course, you've also got the dwarfs right to your west, and so they hate you as well, and it's usually only a matter of time before they will declare war on you as well. So you potentially could have as many as 4 factions that could declare war on you if you allow them to all be at war with you at the same time. On top of that, your starting units as Skrolk are not particularly good. Skaven low-tier units are pretty much some of the worst in the game. And even though you start with some Plague Monk units, which are a little bit buffed by Skrolk, they're certainly not anywhere near the toughest melee infantry in the game, and you're going to be facing some really tough melee infantry, particularly when it comes to the Lizardmen, who are very high armor, very tough and rugged. They can certainly outfight you with melee infantry, and then the dwarfs are the same way. So you got to be really careful. You got to use your Plague Claw catapults as your damage dealers and your heroes, which is the whole point of this entire video, as much as possible, and then just kind of rely on your typical Skaven hit and run tactics, a lot of the running away. But just make sure that your units that can dish out the damage are protected, and pretty much treat all of your melee infantry as expendable, and you should be okay. But you can't just auto-resolve your way through these early fights, you're going to want to try to fight them so that you don't lose any units, which you would do in auto-resolve. It is certainly very possible to win your first battle here against the enemy without losing any units at all, but with auto-resolve, like I said, you will. In the early going, just rely very heavily on your Plague Claw catapults. They do really good damage. They're reasonably accurate for being catapult units. Most of your other units are fairly rubbish, but again, very expendable. Takes a lot of micro to fight these battles, I realize. So I know that the Skaven are not for everyone, but take my word for it. They do get better as you go further and further into the campaign. Now, one of the most important things to do with the Skaven, to keep in mind, particularly for this campaign, is do not overexpand. It's very easy to be tempted to just conquer and occupy every settlement that you attack, and I think that that's a mistake in the long term. What you really need to do is you need to build up some of your food reserves so that when you do occupy, you can occupy them at a higher level, but also you want to make sure that you don't stretch yourself out, stretch yourself too thin, spread yourself out too much where you can't defend the settlements that you've got. So I recommend in the early going not immediately occupying the first settlement here that you can attack. You can. It's always a good idea to be aggressive and defeat the armies, knock out the garrisons, sack them. There's always good value in sacking, but again, just be very careful when it comes to the expansion. And another factor I recommend when it comes to Skrolk early game, if you remember how I mentioned, it's pretty important to not be fighting all of your neighbors at the same time. If you do enough damage in the early turns against this minor lizardmen faction, you can actually get them to pay you off to go to peace with you, peace out with them, and that then would turn around and allow you to go to war and focus against the cult of Sotek, who are most likely going to be your next enemy directly to the south of you. So the other thing that you really need to do in the early game is, in this pretty much is something you're going to want to do throughout your entire campaign, and pretty much any time you play the Skaven, you're going to want to do this, and that is rely very heavily on your ambushing. The jungles are really excellent for helping to hide your armies, to provide you lots of ambushing opportunities. It's a really great way to have one army maybe as bait, and most of your lizardmen are going to think that one army of theirs is superior to one army of yours, which is pretty much true throughout the early game. And so if you use one of your armies as bait and then you put another one in a good ambushing location, you can get a lot of opportunities to actually fight two of your armies against one of theirs. You're still going to suffer casualties, but trust me, it's the best way to try to take out the superior units that the lizardmen are going to have in the early going. As the Skaven, you get access to some pretty useful old world rights. In particular, you want to use the Pestilent Scheme as much as possible. This is what spreads the plagues around. Very effective in reducing the numbers of enemy armies. And if it spreads to your own settlements, it also does a lot of useful buffs to your settlements. Then, of course, you always want to use the Dominating Scheme as much as possible for the additional food, growth, control, and to reduce your recruitment cost, because you're going to do a lot of recruiting in the early going with Skrolk. In this campaign, I decide, after making peace with the Southern Sentinels, to declare war on Cult of Sotek and Tehinoin before they're able to really get in a good position to defend themselves, and frankly, before they declare war on me. It's always somewhat advantageous to declare war on them on your terms when your armies are in position and theirs are not. And in this case, I'm able to get a little bit of money out of it from negotiating with one of the enemies who they're already at war with. And as I mentioned, 1 for 1, our armies are no match for the lizardmen armies. So instead, what we need to do is we need to get Both of our armies down here, even though they're filled with a bunch of Skaven slaves and basically rubbish units, it's still 2 armies against 1. And we can add our chieftains in, and that makes this battle much more manageable. And again, I just sack it because I know it would be very difficult to be able to hold on to it at this point. And just to show exactly why it's important to not overexpand, and in this case to not occupy that settlement, here we can see that Tehinowen is coming back over in this direction with an army that quite frankly is way stronger than even the 2 of ours together. So we need to be pretty careful to not put ourselves in a position where he can catch us in that settlement before we have any chance to build any defenses there. The way to defeat Tehinowen, just like all of the Lizardmen, is effective use of ambushes. And keep in mind, as Skaven, you can ambush while you're on the offensive, as well as during the end turn when you're on the defensive. And here's one little trick that you can use. It's, I guess, kind of questionable whether or not you would consider this to be abusing the AI. I don't think so, personally. I think that this, as long as you have enough movement for it, this makes sense where you're probing enemy defenses until you can eventually find a spot where they're vulnerable. But basically, as long as you got the movement for it, you can keep attacking them over and over again and falling back until, and just repeating the process until you either run out of movement or you successfully get an ambush off on them. As always, when you have a turn or two to basically rest and recover a little bit, and if your army's in good enough shape, you're not under duress by any of your neighbors, then it's always a good idea to try to get in your quest battle. So in this case, I go ahead and fight the Liber Bubonicus at this point. It's a fairly straightforward battle, nothing too fancy about it. I don't want to give any spoilers for anybody because it's always kind of exciting the first time to learn how these quest battles go. But you should be able to handle the quest battle for the Liber Bubonicus without too much trouble, even with just your basic old starting army, as long as you fill it up with some decent clan rats. And of course have your heroes at this point in your army as well. Once Tehinowen himself is defeated, that pretty much opens up the way for you to be able to start taking over his settlements. I would highly suggest doing this an awful lot in the early going with Skrolk, where you basically defend or ambush under circumstances advantageous to you, the player, and focus on wiping out the armies. But once you do wipe out an army or two, that's when you turn around and counterattack and take the settlements, buying yourself a little bit of time then to build up some of the defenses in the settlements to help boost your fighting capabilities whenever they inevitably start throwing armies back at you again. At some point, the Southern Sentinels will probably go back to war with you, and that's okay. Just make sure that you're prepared to defend your territory, again, preferably with the use of ambushes. Make sure that you overwhelm them with your numbers, and you should be fine. In terms of buildings in your settlements, you want to make sure that you have a fair number of order buildings in order to get those bell polishers for Plague Priest capacity, and of course barracks for your chieftain capacity. Other than that, you pretty much probably always want to try to focus on getting as much of your infrastructure build up, your economy build up, so that you can just sustain your armies, of which you will need plenty of them, and of course building the garrisons to help defend. It's always pretty useful for the Skaven in the early going to have those large garrisons to help supplement their relatively weak armies. When the dwarfs declare war on you, again, you want to do the same thing as always. Focus on them. Make sure that you're only fighting them by themselves, and just get as many of your armies together, making sure that they're working in collaboration with one another so that your inferior units at least vastly outnumber the enemy and you can wear them down that way. Most likely your most difficult enemy in the early campaign is going to be Krokgar and the faction of Itza. But again, they are beatable as long as you basically use the same strategy as always, which is to make sure that you're fighting with multiple armies, preferably during ambush battles against him. His units are vastly superior to yours at this point, but the good news is your heroes are starting to get enough experience to make them quite a bit more formidable in battle, and you can kind of lean on them for a little bit to start winning some battles. You can count on your war against Itza to go on for a while, though, so be prepared for that to dominate the majority of your early game. Even though the Skaven all have the possibility of doing ambushes while they're attacking, I still personally tend to prefer using the Lightning Strike skills. I think it's worth the points that it takes to put into Lightning Strike in order to have situations like this where you can basically see they're moving multiple armies down and you want to fight them one at a time. Divide and Conquer is always a very effective strategy, even though in this particular case I ended up not needing it because the ambush worked anyway. But there will be times where they move intelligently in encampment stance, for example, which gives them a bonus to their defending against ambushes, and it would be really nice to be able to attack them one army at a time even when they do that. So again, I always think it's worthwhile to put those points into the blue line. In this campaign, before I expanded particularly far, I already also had Alberic of the Bretonnians declaring war on me, and so I did unfortunately find myself fighting both Itza and Alberic at the same time, but again, it's nothing that you really can't handle. By this point, you should have a decent number of heroes that are pretty high level, or at least high level for this early in the campaign, and again, you can just continue to use your ambushing as much as possible, and it should work for you. And then, of course, in this campaign, I also ended up fighting Marcus Wolfhart as well before I was finished with the other two, so I really had three major factions at war with me at the same time. It is not ideal to do it that way, but sometimes it's going to happen because, again, everybody does hate you. So, and also, you know, it puts some pressure on you. It is a stressful campaign, but it is extremely rewarding when you do succeed at it, and in this particular case, it wasn't really all that difficult to fight the three of them as I was able to focus on one at a time. Now, enough of the advice for the campaign itself, and let's bring this back to what the purpose of the video was, which is talking about why Skrolk is so good with heroes. Well, it starts with this skill right here, Plague Lord, which gives you the ability to start recruiting Plague Priests as soon as you take it, increases your capacity for them, increases the hero recruiting rank, and reduces the upkeep as well. So pretty useful overall, and definitely something that you're going to want to focus on right away. And so you'll find yourself at this point already recruiting Plague Priests at rank 8, which is awesome for this early in the game to go ahead and have 7 skill ups as soon as you recruit the unit in. That's awfully useful. You can get all the way up to giving them the Plague spell, which is extremely powerful right away. And then it only gets better moving forward from here, which we will get to in just a moment. While you're fighting with all of these heroes, you'll start seeing more and more turns that look like this, where the event messages that pop up will just basically be a long list of ranks gained, which is extremely useful. And then you will also start seeing long lists of messages like this, Bell Polisher, which is being idle in a region with an order building. Very easy to do that. You get lots and lots of these bell polishers. Every single one of them increases your capacity for Plague Priests. And so what do you do with all these Plague Priests? Well, you can start moving them forward in front of your front lines and casting with very low winds of magic cost. Lots and lots of summon spells for bringing in some clan rats. while your Plague Claw catapults, or later on your weapons teams, or whatever you want to use to do damage. You can have those things sit back in the back line and fire away to their heart's content while you use your summon spells to clog up the enemy lines. You don't have to worry about doing damage to your own troops with your weapons teams or your catapults or what have you, because these summons, of course, are completely expendable. And here we are as the war with Itza is starting to wind down a little bit. We're in what you would probably consider to be either late early game or early mid game. But in any case, at this point, you can see we already have the capacity to build, to recruit Plague Priests at rank 14, which is pretty epic. You can basically give them every spell in their spell book with a few points left over at this point, just from the moment that you recruit them in. And so then bringing all this together, here we are. At this point, we've got about half of Lustria, so there's still quite a bit of campaign left to go ahead of us, but we're in pretty good shape. We've finished off Itza at this point, but we're still fighting Alberic and Marcus Wolfhart. But you can see we've got really vast capacity for lots and lots of heroes already. It will only continue to grow. We have basically multiple heroes in every single one of our armies, and we have a lot of armies. And then we also have barracks built in most of our different, well, I shouldn't say most settlements, most of our provinces have at least one settlement with a barracks in it, and keeping in mind you only need to build those barracks up to level 2 in order to get the additional capacity for your chieftains. And there you have it. That is my choice for the campaign that gives you the best heroes experience. But again, like I said at the very beginning, there are lots of factions that have really good heroes, and I'm very curious to hear what your opinions are. Would you agree that the Skaven and their prolific use of chieftains and plague priests like this is a good choice, or are there others that I am maybe neglecting or not giving enough credit to? Anyway, please feel free to let me know. I would appreciate it. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.